In the past, I did a video comparing the anime and manga for Demon Slayer. This video is going to be similar, except we are going to cover Netflix Witcher instead. If you're new to the Witcher franchise and just watched the Netflix series, then let us clear some things up first. The story of The Witcher actually begins with the books and not the games. The story in the games begins at the point where the 7th book ends. So if you play the games before reading all these books, you'll actually get spoiled for the ending of not just the books, but also the ending of the Netflix series. In this video, there will be no spoilers regarding that. We are only going to cover the content which was covered in the Netflix series. The first 2 books in the franchise are a collection of short stories which introduces you to different characters in the franchise. Netflix Witcher mainly adapts these first 2 books. However, they made tons and tons of changes, and if the timeline in the show was a bit confusing to you, then after watching this video, everything is going to be much clearer. This video is also sort of like a summary of the first 2 books, so if you are in for just a good time, then sit back, relax and enjoy. With that being said, let us begin at the very first book, which is titled The Last Wish. This book is a collection of different short stories, and it begins with Geralt recovering his wounds at a temple. This temple is called the Temple of Melitele, and it was mentioned in the Netflix series as well, but it was not shown. He got these wounds after a battle he had just had with a Striga. Looking at his wounds, he starts thinking about this battle, and then we go into a flashback which covers this story. The Striga story in the book is simply titled The Witcher. It introduces us to Geralt, his profession, and what sort of character he is. In this story, we also learn that monsters are weak to silver. This is why Geralt uses a silver chain and a silver sword against the Striga in the story. This story was the 3rd episode in the Netflix series, and story-wise, it was pretty much the same in the books as it was in the show. There were a couple of changes here and there, such as Triss. In the books, she was not involved in this story at all, and Geralt directly deals with the king and his henchmen. I believe Netflix introduced her here early so that her character has more impact in the final episode. In the books, Triss doesn't really appear much, if at all, in the first 2 books. The fight that Geralt had with the Striga in the books was quite detailed, and tons of other stuff happens. The cinematic intro for Witcher 1, animated by CD Projekt Red for their first Witcher game, actually covers this battle too. CD Projekt Red animated this intro word by word as it was in the books. You can watch that later and then compare that cinematic to the Netflix series. This fight with the Striga ends with Geralt getting slashed on his neck by the claws of the Striga. This is the exact same wound that Geralt is recovering from back at the Temple of Melitele. Episode 3 of the Netflix series also covers some bits of Yennefer's past. This portion doesn't exist in the first 2 books at all. We'll get back to that later, but for now let us continue the story as it was told in the books. After his battle with the Striga, we are back in the temple where Geralt is recovering his wounds. In the morning, he wakes up and the priestess at the temple named Nenneke offers Geralt to see his future because she thinks that Geralt is surrounded by some sort of fate or destiny. But Geralt refuses. After this, we get another short story in his flashback which is titled A Grain of Truth. The short story was not covered in the Netflix series at all. However, from what I heard, it is going to be covered in season 2 of the series, but in a very different manner. Since we are not going to cover any season 2 spoilers in this video, let us just leave it at that. Moving on, after this second short story, we are back with Geralt and we see 2 knights arrive at the temple. These knights are ordered by the Prince of Elondor to drive Geralt out of town. Elondor is the place where this Temple of Melitele is located, so Prince can actually pass that order. These knights say that neither they and neither their prince is going to tolerate the presence of this Witcher, the Butcher of Blaviken, in their area. The priestess Nenneke at the temple is actually pretty close to Geralt, so she tries to stand up for him and says that this is not Elondor, but the Temple of Melitele, and she will not tolerate the presence of these knights in the temple. Geralt stops her and says that he's going to leave in 3 days on his own. The knights get offended, and one of the knights, who is sort of childish and an idiot, challenges Geralt to a duel. The other knight stops him and takes him away though, and they both leave. But before leaving, he says that they will be back soon. Since the knights mentioned Geralt as the Butcher of Blaviken earlier, we now get the next story, which is titled the lesser evil. You probably already guessed, this is the story of Geralt, which was covered in the very first episode of the Netflix series. On the side, there was also Ciri and Cintra's story in the first episode, but that was not covered in the books until much later. Again, we will get back to Ciri's story just like Yennefer's story, but for now let us go in the order of the books. So, the lesser evil is the story of Geralt and Yennefer. Basic premise of the story in the show and in the books is largely the same. However, the missing details in the show makes this story in the books a lot more impactful. The story in the books begins with Geralt arriving in the town of Blaviken. A market festival is supposed to be taking place in Blaviken the next day. However, Geralt simply wants to gain some money for the Kikimora that he killed earlier. So he meets Striga and they have the talk that they had in the show. He talks about the curse of the Black Sun and how children born during the eclipse are evil. If you played Witcher 3, you might be familiar with this curse because there is a character in the game who is supposedly cursed with the same thing. In the past, Striga and other mages researched this curse, and while they were researching, they had doubts about whether or not this curse was real. So they started killing or imprisoning the people who were supposedly cursed with this thing. Make no mistake, these mages were not at all sure whether the curse was real or not. They simply believed that the end of the world can happen because of the people who are afflicted with this curse. So instead of risking that, they decided to kill all those people because it was the lesser evil. And now Striga tries to get Geralt to do the same thing. Geralt disagrees and makes his famous speech,
"If I'm to choose between one evil and another, I'd rather not choose at all."
This tells you something about Geralt's character, and that is, he tries to stay neutral in all public matters. He is not a hero or a knight, he is simply a witcher who kills monsters. So, Geralt advises Striga. In the books, this did not happen in the show. Geralt advises Striga to ask help from the law. Since his tower is in Blaviken, he is the mage of the town, and the law is going to protect him. But Striga doesn't care about that. Yennefer cannot enter into his tower anyways. He simply wants to get rid of Yennefer so he don't have to look over his shoulder for the rest of his life. Geralt leaves and then later he meets Yennefer. She tells him her side of the story. The thing about the curse is it the curse that makes all these people do bad things, or is it the bad treatment that these people have to endure which makes them do the bad things? Knowing that, Yennefer asks Geralt to choose the lesser evil and kill Striga for her. Geralt again says no, and Yennefer implies that she'll leave Blaviken the next day. In the morning, while Geralt is having a conversation with someone, he realizes what Yennefer plans to do. Remember, after Geralt wakes up, it is the day of the market festival in Blaviken, so lots of people are going to be in the market. Yennefer and her mercenaries plans to kill all the innocent people at the market festival one by one, until Striga of course comes out of his tower. Now here's the thing, Geralt tries to stay neutral in most of the cases. When he realizes what Yennefer is going to do, he goes to the market and he does what he does in the Netflix show as well. He saved all the people of Blaviken, but they didn't know that. They watch him kill Yennefer and all her mercenaries, thinking they were innocent because at the time when he reaches the market, Yennefer and her men hasn't killed anyone. Since the people of Blaviken think that he killed all those innocent people, they start calling him the Butcher of Blaviken. So why did Geralt decide to do this? Did he finally think that it was the lesser evil to kill Yennefer and her men and save the people of Blaviken? Well, maybe he did, but was that really the lesser evil, or he should have agreed with Yennefer and helped her kill Striga instead? Well, I cannot answer that because that is just for you to decide. After this short story about Butcher of Blaviken, we are out of the flashback and back with Geralt in the temple of Melitele. This time, Geralt is talking to a girl from the temple named Iola, and he tells her various things about himself and his past as a witcher. This portion didn't exist in the Netflix series, but I think it is extremely important because it gives you little details about witches and their past. So Geralt tells Iola that he carries two swords. One is steel and another is silver. People believe that steel is for humans and silver is for monsters, but that is incorrect, and that is not me telling you that. That is what Geralt says. Many people who have only played the games might actually have this misconception. In the games, Geralt has two swords on him all the time, and he uses steel for humans and silver for monsters. In reality, this was actually changed in the game for gameplay reasons. In the books, Silver Sword is only meant for some specific magical monsters. For non-magical monsters, a steel sword would work just as good, if not better, than a silver sword. Now, Geralt tells Iola that his home is the fortress of Kaer Morhen. It is the place where he grew up with Vesemir and received his Witcher training. Vesemir is an older Witcher who is sort of like a father figure to Geralt. You hear about Vesemir in the final episode of the Netflix series, but you don't get to see him. So, Geralt says that at Kaer Morhen, he went through the trial of the grasses, which are the mutations that humans go through in order to become a Witcher. Their bodies are subjected to many elixirs, magic, herbs and all of that. Geralt took this trial very well. He was exceptionally rare in that case, so his body was put through even more complicated trial than an average Witcher. Only about 2 or 3 kids out of 10 survive the trial of the grasses to begin with, and then even the more complicated ones, no one survives those. Geralt is the only Witcher who has survived the further trials. His hair turned white as a result of those further trials, and he lost all pigmentation on his skin. After he finished his training at Kaer Morhen, he earned his Witcher medallion. His medallion looks like a wolf because Kaer Morhen is the Witcher school of the wolf. These medallions are used by Witchers to detect magic. After Geralt left Kaer Morhen, he met his first monster on the way, which was bald and had rotten teeth. This bit actually does exist in the show. It was in the very first episode when Geralt is talking to Roach before Renfri appears. His experience at that point is what made Geralt realize that he is not a knight or not a hero, but he's just a Witcher and he needs to stay neutral in most cases if possible. The reason he's telling all of this to Iola is because he's conflicted about whether he chose the lesser evil or not with Renfri. When he is done talking, he thinks about destiny that surrounds him and also about Cintra. Then comes the next short story, which is titled A Question of Price. This short story was actually covered in episode 4 of the Netflix series. It is the one where Geralt goes to the banquet in Cintra and he meets Queen Calanthe, her daughter Pavetta and Duny the Hedgehog. For the most part, the story was told pretty accurately in the show with few changes here and there, such as Jaskier or Dandelion was actually not present at Cintra in the books. Queen Calanthe specifically called Geralt over to the feast because she knew Duny was going to show up and ask to take Pavetta due to the law of surprise. If you're confused about what the law of surprise is, it is the oldest form of payment in the Witcher universe. When a person saves another, they can invoke the law of surprise as a payment. This law of surprise could be worded in different ways, such as I want what you will find at home yet don't expect. So if a person returns home and finds something unexpected, it will now belong to his savior. This something could be anything from as simple as a new pet, or maybe some new crop in his field, or very rarely a new child because the wife of the person was pregnant before he left his house. It is said that destiny guides the prize in such cases and must be honored. Also in the books, Geralt was at this feast under a disguise of the name Ravix of Fawnhorn. You can actually find references to this in Witcher 3. Apart from this, the story went pretty similarly in the books as it did in the show. At the end of everything, however, in the show it is shown that Geralt invokes the law of surprise on Duny and shows some sort of regret in doing that. In the books, however, it is the complete opposite. He explains to everyone that witches are sterile, so they cannot have children of their own, so they don't have anyone to pass their knowledge to. This is one of the reasons there are very few witches left on the continent. However, there are tons of monsters still around. In order to help with that, witches invoke the law of surprise on people, and if destiny wants, they will have a child to pass their knowledge on to next. They can invoke the law of surprise, and if they are awarded with a child, they can turn that child into a witcher, which is what Geralt intends to do with Duny's child. They agree and Geralt leaves, saying that he will be back in 6 years to see if destiny sides with him and if he can raise the child as a witcher. That marks the end of the short story, and we move back to the present with Geralt at the temple. This time at the temple, he has a friend visiting him who is none other than Dandelion or Jaskier. They talk for a while and then Dandelion asks Geralt if he remembers the time they met, and then we get the flashback for the story titled The Edge of the World. This story was covered in the second episode of the Netflix series. However, only half of the story was actually covered in the show. This is the story where Geralt and Jaskier meet for the first time, and then they meet Tork the Sylvian. Then they get captured by the elves, and there is the entire talk about how humans hate elves and kill them in the past. The difference between the show and the books is that at the end of the story in the show, the elves just let Geralt and Jaskier go on their way. In the books, that wasn't the case. In the books, they were actually pretty much ready and about to kill them both, but they were saved by a goddess called Leafia. She's known as the goddess of the fields, and she appears, then she talks about something telepathically to the elves, after which they get on their horses and get ready to leave. Toruiel gives Jaskier a new lute because she broke his lute earlier, and Filavandrel tells Geralt that he hopes Geralt doesn't disappoint him when they inevitably meet on the fields of battle. The story ends with Geralt, Jaskier, and Tork the Sylvian sitting by a campfire talking about different monsters. Now, after this story, we are back in the temple with Geralt in the present. In case you haven't noticed, this temple portion is happening in the present, and certain things at the temple reminds Geralt of his past, which is how the short stories are told. The wound on his neck reminded him of his battle with the Striga, which is when we got the first short story. When the knights at the temple called Geralt the Butcher of Blaviken, he remembered his story with Renfri. Talking with Iola and thinking about destiny made him remember his time in Cintra. Dandelion reminded him of his time at the edge of the world. And now Geralt is talking about Yennefer with Priestess Nenneke, which is when we get the final story of this first book, which is The Last Wish. This is the title of the very first book in the franchise and also the title of the final short story in this first book. This is the story of how Geralt met Yennefer, and it was covered in episode 5 of the Netflix series. This is the story of the Djinn granting Geralt his 3 wishes. Though the main premise of this story was the same in both, quite a few things were changed in the Netflix show. To begin with, when Geralt and Jaskier find the magic lamp, the genie comes out and he looks like a red mist, similar to how Jafar is depicted in Disney's Aladdin. Dandelion starts making his wishes, but the Djinn doesn't grant them. Instead, the Djinn begins to strangle Jaskier. Geralt tries to fight the Djinn, but he is powerless in front of him. So instead, Geralt decides to use an ancient method of exorcism on the genie. Geralt used to think that this exorcism was complete bullshit, but he says this chant and then the genie disappears beyond the lake. Jaskier's throat is affected, so then the events turn out in a similar fashion as it did in the show. However, in the show they did change this bit. Geralt is holding the seal of the lamp, so that is why the Djinn is granting Geralt's wishes and not Jaskier's. When he says that he wants some damn peace, the Djinn granted him his wish and destroyed Jaskier's throat. That is how it happened in Netflix series. Then they go on to meet Yennefer, and the most of the events turn out the same way in both the book and the show, except for one thing. When Geralt tells Yennefer what had happened, he tells her the exorcism that he used. Hearing that, Yennefer laughs. Later we find out that the exorcism that Geralt said in front of the genie translates to "get out of here and fuck yourself." So the first wish that Geralt made in the book was this. This is also the reason the genie is now very pissed, because he's been away, forced to grant Geralt's wish in a way I can't even imagine. He is ready to come back to destroy the entire town, but he cannot attack Geralt because Geralt is his master. So back in prison, Geralt makes his second wish, which is making the guard explode. Now Geralt has one last wish remaining. At this point in the show, the entire house where Yennefer is gets destroyed. However, in the books, this battle is a whole lot bigger. The entire town of Rinde gets pretty much destroyed in this battle, and there are many different people involved in this fight, and it is not just Geralt and Yennefer. The way Geralt saves Yennefer was by uttering his third wish. He wishes to bind his fate with hers. The exact words of the wish were actually not revealed in the books, but I guess it was something like, "I want to be with Yennefer forever." This binds their fate together, and the genie is finally free to leave, so he bails from there. This was the final story in the first book. After this, we are back with Geralt in the temple of Melitele. If you remember correctly, the knights who challenged Geralt said that they will be back. As Geralt and Jaskier are about to leave the temple, they are stopped by the knights, but this time they are not alone. They have the guards and the captain of the prince's guard with them. At this point, they give Geralt an impossible situation. They tell him that he must accept the challenge of the knight from before. However, since he is a knight, Geralt cannot attack him back, and if he does, he's going to be punished by the law. Geralt, to everyone's surprise, accepts the challenge. Then as soon as the knight is about to attack Geralt with his sword, Geralt dodges and deflects it so hard that the knight's sword gets pushed back and hits him in the face. Technically, Geralt didn't hit him, the knight got hurt with his own sword, so Geralt is allowed to live in peace. Remember that earlier in the temple, Nenneke offered Geralt to see his future. Iola, the girl at the temple, was actually supposed to be a medium in order to see Geralt's future. Before Geralt leaves the temple, Iola touches Geralt by mistake, and the trance begins, which shows Nenneke, Iola and Geralt his future. What they see is nothing good. It is a very violent and bloody future, so Nenneke asks Geralt to not leave the temple. Geralt says that there is no point in living while looking over his shoulder, so he leaves and Nenneke wipes her tears. This is the point where the first book completely ends. Now you might have noticed we've reached the end of the first book, but we still haven't heard anything about Ciri or Yennefer for that matter. They hardly appear in the first two books. The thing is, all the versions of Ciri and Yennefer in the show are actually expanded or completely made up. They didn't exist in the books at all. In the case of Yennefer, actually, her past is pretty accurate to the books. She did grow up as a hunchback in the books as well. She did study in Aretuza to become a sorceress, but in the books there are hardly 2 paragraphs about all of this. In the Netflix series, they expanded on her past. However, in the case of Ciri, her story is completely made up in the show. The destruction of Cintra did happen in the books as well. She did escape from Cintra, and Cahir, the Nilfgaardian guy with the feather helmet, did chase Ciri, and this experience of her in Cintra and with Cahir even gave Ciri nightmares for a long time. But apart from that, pretty much everything else in the show relating to Ciri is made up. The second book in the franchise is titled The Sword of Destiny. It has 6 short stories, out of which only 3 are covered in the Netflix show, and even then they are so different in the show that you might as well call them entirely different stories. The only one story which is actually accurate to the books is the first one, called The Bounds of Reason. It is the story about villain Trettenmirth or the 3 jackdaws, the Golden Dragon. It was covered in the 6th episode of the show. In the books, there is actually a time where the Golden Dragon allows the others to fight him one-on-one. The dragon obviously wins. The other changes in this story are mostly dialogue based. At one point in this story, Geralt asks Va about why she is with Borch. She says that he is the most beautiful. The story in the books ends with Geralt finally understanding those words and says he is indeed the most beautiful. The second, third and the fourth story of the second book were actually not covered in the Netflix series at all. However, the last 2 short stories were in the show, but they were changed quite a lot. The last 2 stories are about Ciri, and they are actually really good in the books as compared to the Netflix show. The 5th story, titled The Sword of Destiny, is about Geralt and Ciri. In the show, Ciri escapes from Cintra and meets that elf called Dara, and then she goes into the Brokilon forest. In the books, none of that Dara business and the Mousesack business happens. In the show, Geralt was present at the fall of Cintra, but in the books that was not the case. First of all, Ciri actually visits Brokilon forest before the fall of Cintra. At one point in the story, Calanthe wishes to marry Ciri as soon as possible, but Ciri doesn't want to get married, so she runs away and hides in the Brokilon forest. Geralt at this point is actually visiting the Brokilon forest to deliver a message to the Dryad Queen Ithene. So anyways, when Geralt is visiting the Brokilon forest, he actually runs into a very young Ciri. Yes, they do meet for the first time ever in Brokilon forest and not in the random forest which you see at the end of episode 8 in the Netflix show. but at first he doesn't know who she is. However, as they talk more and more, he finds out that Ciri is actually the daughter of Juni and Pavetta. She is the same girl who is bound to him by destiny due to the law of surprise which happened in the short story of the first book. At the end of the short story, Geralt and Ciri actually go their separate ways. After coming out of the Brokilon forest, Ciri goes with Mousesack and Geralt goes on his own way. So why didn't Geralt take Ciri with him when he met her in the Brokilon forest? Well, it's simple. It is explained in the books that Geralt didn't believe in destiny. He actually went to Cintra at one point, but he tells Galanthi that he will not take Ciri with him because destiny is not enough and there needs to be something more. This brings us to the final story of the second book, which is also the final story that we will discuss in this video, and it is titled Something More. The Netflix series uses portion from the story in the final episode, which is episode 8. At the beginning of this story, Geralt does meet a merchant in the books as well, but this merchant is not cleaning up bodies. His cart is actually broken, so he asks Geralt for help. He tells Geralt that if he's going to help him, the merchant will grant him anything he wants. Hearing this, Geralt actually invokes the law of surprise on the merchant. He fights some monsters, he gets injured, and then the rest plays out in a similar fashion as it did on the show. While Geralt is on his back on the cart, he fades in and out of consciousness and he thinks back on various different things and talks to the merchant while he can. The things that he thinks about includes the Battle of Sodden, the thing with his mother. That part from the show was actually in the books as well. At one point during their journey, Geralt thinks back on the time when Cintra was attacked. He was actually on his way to Cintra at that time, but he meets Dandelion or Jaskier on his way, and Dandelion tells him what had happened in Cintra. Cintra was destroyed. Galanthi was killed along with the entire royal family. Hearing this, Geralt simply assumed that Ciri is dead and goes on his separate way instead of going to Cintra because there is nothing left for him in Cintra anymore. In the show, this was changed and it was shown that Geralt was present in Cintra during its fall, but in the books, that was not the case. Then later, the merchant who is carrying Geralt actually talks to him and tells him that he is not going to find what he is expecting with the law of surprise because the merchant and his wife are way beyond the time where they could have children. So they continue their journey and they reach the merchant's home. When they reach there, they find out that the merchant's wife had taken a war orphan, and that orphan is none other than Ciri. So the two meet, run towards each other, and they hug. This scene was in the show, but it didn't make much sense because in the show, Ciri had never seen Geralt before. In the books, they met in the Brokilon forest, but in the show they didn't, so they should not know how the other looks like. So when Geralt and Ciri meet each other at this point in the books, Geralt had invoked the law of surprise 2 times on 2 different people, once on Juni and once on the merchant, and both times Ciri ended up being his destiny. So at this point, Ciri asks Geralt if he now believes that she is indeed his destiny. To which Geralt replies that no, she is not just his destiny, she is something more. The second book and the first season of Netflix Witcher ends. So now you probably have a good idea about the timeline of the story in the books. In the books, it is pretty straightforward because pretty much all of the stories are told from the perspective of Geralt. The show, however, tells you the story from the perspective of 3 different characters. The way that Netflix is telling these stories is similar to how Marvel tells the story of their characters in their cinematic universe. You get the story of Iron Man, and then you get the story of Captain America, which took place years before the story of Iron Man. And now, with Black Widow, even though she's dead, we are getting a movie about her past. All these stories then converge together in Avengers, which is basically what will happen now in the second season of Witcher, because it will cover the main novels of the franchise. In terms of timings and years, Yennefer and Geralt's story begins many years ago as compared to Ciri. Yen's story comes first. She goes through her transformation from a hunchback and then studied in Aretuza. During this time, Geralt was going through the trial of the grasses and through his Witcher training. Afterwards comes his Butcher of Blaviken story, his fight with the Striga, then he meets Dandelion, then he goes to the banquet in Cintra. At this point, Ciri is actually not born, but her mother, Pavetta, is pregnant with Ciri. After this banquet and the law of surprise, At one point, Geralt meets Yennefer with the Jinn arc, and then later they break up in the Golden Dragon story. During the time when Geralt and Yennefer meet, Ciri is born. She grows up and her parents, Pavetta and Duny, die. At this point, it has been many years since the banquet of Cintra. Ciri is all grown up, so Geralt goes back to Cintra to claim his law of surprise, and the attack of Nilfgaard happens. When Nilfgaard attacked Cintra, it started a war with Nilfgaard. At this point, each character is going through their own arcs. Geralt gets injured in the ghoul attack and is being carried on a cart. Yennefer is fighting at Sodden Hill. Ciri is escaping and going through the Brokilon forest. Eventually, the fight at Sodden Hill ends. Geralt reaches the home of the merchant who he saved, and Ciri is with the merchant's wife, and then she meets Geralt. So that was it. I hope this video helped you understand the differences between the show and the books. I really do recommend you to check out the books yourself because they are really good. The reading order of the books is going to be on your screen, and if you're thinking about playing the games, I recommend you do that after you read the books, because as I said earlier, the story in the books begins at the point where the 7th book ends, so there are going to be many spoilers in the game. With that being said, please look forward to the 2nd season of Netflix Witcher. It is probably going to cover the main novels of the franchise, and there are going to be no more timeline hopping in season 2, so the story is going to be more streamlined. If there is still something that confuses you, please feel free to ask me in the comments below or on my social media. I love this franchise and I love talking about it, so hop on in my messages and I'll be happy to talk about it with you. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like and I will see you next time.